This afternoon, we are very glad to welcome the creative, curious, and very talented Yolanda Acree as our guest presenter to give us a window into the shantytowns of the Kent Narrows. But before we jump into that, there's a few quick things to go over. We always start our Sunday suppers off with a little history and information on the aims of these gatherings. Our mission is a pretty simple one, and that is to enhance racial understanding, awareness, and respect through open conversation. The Sunday Supper Committee was formed in 2016 as a spinoff of the Equity Committee. Since then, we've hosted both in-person and online conversations. While they are open to the general public, we've also purposely reached out to county lawmakers, educators, students, law enforcement, the Latinx community, the faith-based community, leaders in sports and recreation, and lots of other groups so that we can make sure we have a diverse and representative attendance. For our past in-person events, we've had smaller table groupings and usually provide a meal so that our guests can break bread together. We then move into facilitated conversation with questions or prompts and reconvene to share with the whole gathering what we've explored and discussed. Our format for today will parallel that in-person version of Sunday Suppers, and it's pretty simple. After I finish up with our intros, we will hear a brief presentation from Yolanda, and then we will split off into smaller breakout groups. Each group will have one facilitator that will guide you through an icebreaker and then into the guided conversation. After we've rounded out our conversation, we'll pop back into this larger original group and we'll share basically a highlight reel of what we talked about, as well as any other final thoughts or questions that everybody might have. Before we get into things, I'd like to take a moment to share 6 goals that we should be striving for, not just today, but basically any time that we want to engage productively with other people. They are taken directly from the book, Compassionate Conversations, How to Speak and Listen from the Heart. The first is to be for each other. Remember that we want the best for other people. All people want to be heard, to feel respected, and to be valued. Number 2 is to listen well. We want to practice reflective listening skills, listen to understand and not just to respond. Number 3 is to talk straight, speak your truth in a way that is concise, and be mindful of the space and time that you make for others to respond as well. Number 4 is to give support and challenge. When we feel safe, we perform better, take more risks, and are willing to make mistakes. But too much safety can be unproductive. Challenges keep our groups exciting, dynamic, and creative, and they help us to learn and grow. Support by offering acknowledgement that you hear others, and challenge by asking thoughtful questions. Number 5 is to use praise. While we aren't here for kudos or to compete for who has done more or better, it's okay to express appreciation for others. And finally, number 6 is to keep agreements, and we can start by upholding our ground rules. As we go into the conversation portion of this evening, or this afternoon, I'd like for everyone to keep in mind that we are here to build relationships and to strengthen our community. We are all here to learn. Mistakes will happen, and that's okay. We may have to navigate conversations or topics that are uncomfortable to us, and that's also okay. But bullying or hate speech or aggressive behavior that undermines the ability of the group to communicate with honesty and respect will not be tolerated and will result in removal from the conversation. We ask that you please keep your camera on during your breakout groups. You can keep them off right now and during the presentation, and to use the chat feature to submit any questions that you have for Yolanda during her presentation. I just basically want everybody to remember that your presence here is actively helping to build our community into a stronger, better place for everybody, and that we're very, very glad that you're here. So now it is my very great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for tonight, Yolanda Acree. She is a community historian and collage artist. She is native to Caroline County, Maryland. She is the program coordinator for Queen Anne's County's community mentoring program through Minnery's Dream Alliance, which is an amazing program that we got to feature during our last Sunday Supper. So I know we're all really excited to hear from her, so I'm going to pass the mic on.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out. Just to share a little bit more about myself, I sort of got interested in local Black history on the Eastern Shore a few years ago because there was just a lack of sort of local Black history. Of course, we love and know a lot about Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, but not so much is known about the history of everyday residents on the shore. So I started a Facebook account and Instagram account called Black Eastern Shore, where I share just information that I find, events pertaining to Black history on the Eastern Shore. So if you're not already following, some of you may and just not know the face behind the account. But if you're not already following, please go over, and follow those accounts if you're interested in learning more about the local Black history from the Eastern Shore. All right, so let's jump into this presentation. One second.
I'm going to link that Facebook group right now in the chat for everybody. because it is awesome. There's so much great history that you pop up on there all the time.
Yes, it's really, and I've connected with so many people around the shore from those accounts. So just a brief overview of what this project is looking to do. We are documenting the community history of the Black residents and laborers who lived on Kent Narrows during the 20th century. In that documentation, we are collecting oral histories, photographs, and any artifacts we may find, as well as documentation from public sources such as newspapers and other records. The results of this documentation is to create an interpret exhibit, which we will be opening this summer, and it will be located at the Kennard Center in Centerville. And also we hope to produce a book, and we'd like to get a public marker somewhere in the region as well to educate people about this history, because if you go to Kent Narrows now, there's nothing there that tells you that this community existed. I always forget. Oh, now I gotta go back. Hold on. There we go.
Always fun wrestling with those.
I know, I should have played with this a little bit more while we were waiting. Okay, so just an overview of the history from about the 1930s through the 1980s. These shanties existed on Kent Narrows. The people who lived in them worked for the seafood packing plants. There were about a dozen plants on the Narrows. Only one still exists today, which is the Harris Packing House that's next door to the restaurant. At the height, there were about 200 shanties in the region. And the importance of this project is just to highlight this history because it's valuable, but also because it has largely been excluded from the narrative about the seafood industry and the Kent Narrows and Chesapeake Bay heritage in the area. So we want to make sure that all voices are included and, recognize their importance in telling the complete story of the region. This picture here actually came from one of our participants. These are shanties that was in the area known as Sandpile, which was a neighborhood within the community. And I'll show you a little bit later sort of a map that I put together to show you where all the different little neighborhoods were. But Sandpile was sort of in the area where Bridges restaurant is, the parking lot, sorry, Bridges parking lot and the boatyard and the crab deck. Sandpile was sort of in that area. Oh, I think we skipped another one. Oh, there we go. So the inspiration for this project is Miss Minnie Rebecca Brown. She was the great-grandmother of Donzella Wilson, who Mary Ellen noted is the founder of My Nary's Dream Alliance, which is doing a lot of great work in the Midshore region. The name of the organization, My Nary's, is actually a combination of her two grandmothers, Minnie and Mary. So Minnie migrated from Exmoor, Virginia. She worked for Herman S. Thompson and B&S Fisheries, owned by Jean Stelmach. Jean Stelmach was the only woman owner of the seafood packing houses. And this is her actually standing in her shanty, and she's wearing her rubber apron that was used while they were shucking oysters. Donzella approached me about this project just because of my interest in the history. I'm also an author, by the way. And I was just so, honored to be able to take on this project and bring it to life. So the oral histories are really a big part of this project and really guiding the direction of this project. So I wanted to give, a little overview of what the interviews entail. So we're obviously interviewing former shanty residents and laborers who worked in the packing houses. We're also interviewing Narrows residents who did not live in the shanties, but lived in the community of the Narrows. So there were Black property owners who lived in this region as well. Business owners, there were lots of beer gardens and restaurants that were in the community. And then also the watermen. Some of the watermen grew up in the shanties, some did not. but they are also an integral part of this community story. Um, the interviews have been predominantly women, so this is also an important um, addition to not only Black history on the shore, but also women's history. So far, we've completed 18 individual interviews and 2 group interviews. We also had a little meet and greet for the former residents at the Graceville Community Center back in November, which was awesome. Um, and these interviews are being recorded via audio, which you will get to hear clips from the interviews in the actual exhibit. So talking a little bit more about the oral histories, I wanted to share some photographs that we collected from the former residents themselves and highlight a few of their stories. So the first is Mrs. Iris Jones Wright. Her family is native to Queen Anne's County. Her mother, Clementine, which is featured in the second picture at the top in the center, and her picture's on the top right or maybe left. Not sure how you're viewing that, but her mother worked in the packing houses and her father was a farmer. And she shucked oysters, clams, and she picked crabs. And she worked for Evans Crab House and Harold Thomas and Sons and Herman Thompson as well. And one of the things that Miss Ira shared with me is that her mother was very short. And every day when she went to work to shuck the oysters, she wore high heels to work while she was shucking. I can't say that I would do the same doing that, but it was something that she wanted to do. I guess it gave her confidence, made her feel good about doing a job that's not so glamorous. And also Miss Iris started shucking her own oysters when she was just 5 years old. It wasn't safe for her mother to leave her at home by herself. So she started bringing her with her to the packing house. And the foreman at that time set Mrs. Iris up, gave her a little stool. She had her own apron, taught her how to shuck an oyster. And he would give her candy as well, just to keep her quiet throughout the time. But yeah, she started shucking oysters at 5 years old, and she continued to do so on the weekends and the summers when she wasn't attending school. And the photos that I shared on the previous page, as well as the photos on the top 2, are from her personal collection of photographs. Miss Dorothy Keene, if you move to the center row, those 2 photos there are of her mother, Mrs. Rosie Sorrell, and her father, Mr. Nathaniel Vini. They both worked in the packing houses. Her father was a tallyman, so he would count the oysters and pack them into containers and things. Her mother is actually standing in the doorway of their shanty, and they had 10 children in their shanty, if you can imagine that. And then her father and her aunt and uncle are standing next to him in front of like an oyster rigging device. I'm not sure exactly how that works, but that's what's in the background. Captain Lewis Carter, he is a waterman. His family also lived in the shanties. If you look at the bottom row in the center, that is his father. He's sitting on his father's lap. They're in front of their shanty. Mr. Lewis reported that he was drawn to the water from, a young age, and it's just something that gave him a sense of freedom. He bought his first boat at the age of 17. He ended up going away into the war, but after the war, he returned and decided to take up, oystering, tonging full time. So that is a picture of him on his boat, tonging for oysters. And then we have Miss Tanya Brown. She did not live in a shanty, but she lived in a home, within the community. So she lived with her great-grandmother who owned a home in the area. And her aunt, her father's sister, actually owned a business, a restaurant and hotel called Sarah Blue's Hotel and Restaurant. And she completed the poster that you see at the top I don't know if it's right or left, but at the top. And their property was actually, I guess they had to sell it due to eminent domain when they started building the new bridge. And a lot of Black property owners in this area, lost their property when they decided to build the new bridge in Kent Narrows. And then I want to draw your attention to the other two photos on the side, the newspaper clipping and the Portside Inn. Bruce Pulley is a Graysonville native. He didn't live in the shanties, but he grew up in the county, and he was a photographer, African American. And he had a collection of photos that his wife still has that she shared with me. The newspaper clipping is from Hurricane David, and it shows a woman, Miss Ethel Royal, standing in front of her shanty. And as you can see, the water is very high. And this was a common occurrence due to high tides and other weather events. It was a common occurrence for the shanties to be flooded on a regular basis. They would have to bail themselves out. Things would be floating around. And when things were particularly bad, they would go to what is now the Graysonville Community Center. It was the Graysonville Colored Elementary School prior to that. But they would go there to shelter in place, when things were particularly bad. And then the photo below that is the Portside Inn. It was actually a business, a restaurant that existed before. Well, it's not where the jetty sits now. And it was Black owned by a few gentlemen, Mr. Montreux Wright, who was also a waterman and captain, Mr. Bob Matthews, and another individual. So some of the themes that have come out of these oral histories are, one, migration. Many of the people that I've talked to, their families migrated from Central Virginia and the Eastern Shore of Virginia. Some of them stopped in Crisfield before coming to the Narrows, but they sort of made their way up the coast to Kent Narrows, just looking for more economic opportunities. There are also, native Queen Anne's County residents who worked in the packing houses. And, over time, after decades and decades, they sort of became no longer migrants, but, a part of this community. And community was also a big theme as well. So every person I talked to talked about how close-knit the people were in the community. Everyone looked out for each other. If somebody didn't have something, somebody would provide it. They talked about, people being outside, just cooking outside, cooking big meals, big pots for everyone to share. How some of the elderly people who didn't work anymore, how they would look out for the younger kids, and you could get disciplined by, your neighbor, but also when your mom got or your parents got home, you got disciplined again. And the community just, they had to look out for each other because sort of no one else was. They talked about the hesitancy of the ambulance or police to come into the community. So they were really responsible for taking care of themselves. Another theme is genealogy. As I stated, the families came, some of them came from other areas, Virginia, and ended up staying over time. All of these families became very interconnected. I swear every time I talk to someone, they would mention someone else's last name. And I'm like, wait a minute, are you related to so-and-so? And they'd be like, yeah, that's my cousin, or, distantly. So it's really like one big family. And I hope that one day I have the time to actually create a family tree just to show how all of these families are so connected. It's amazing. So then some other things came up regarding the social climate of the times. So some shared with me about a sit-in that happened at Holly's. Holly's was segregated, Holly's restaurant. A sit-in happened there, and also about the Freedom Riders coming to town in 1964. And they marched to the Bay Bridge, and many other participants were arrested. And also, there's a racial element to this as well. All of the workers were Black and the plant owners were white. And some of the participants shared that, sometimes even though they were being paid for their work, the setup of the environment felt like slavery. It felt like they were living on a plantation, with their work being right there, next to their homes, and just how that all, I guess, the daily life and just how it occurred just felt like um, plantation life to them. Um, Also, not only was highly segregated, Fisherman's Inn didn't allow Black patrons. They had Black cooks in their kitchen, but no Black patrons were allowed. And thinking about how this community was very integral to the success of the Narrows, but they have not benefited from that success as well. So that's a thing. And then finally, speaking about housing. So as the packing houses began to close in the late 70s and early 80s, many of the residents, were forced to move or chose to move. And Queen Anne's County really lacked affordable housing compared to its neighboring counties, Caroline and Talbot. So some people migrated to those counties when they decided to leave, and others were, assisted by housing specialists to find a home within the county. But many, stayed up until the very end because they didn't have any place to go. So digging deeper into the housing situation is very important. Fisher Manor was built in Graysonville. The land was actually donated by a Black entrepreneur, Frank Fisher, to build this affordable housing community on it. And many of the residents did move to Fisher Manor as well. And the, establishment of the Queen Anne's County Housing Authority, which was established in the 80s, this was one catalyst to the development of the actual Queen Anne's County Housing Authority. So definitely some interesting themes running through the interviews, and a lot of topics that we will dig into further in the actual exhibit. This picture is actually from one of our participants, Mr. Warner Hatton. This is his kindergarten class. I forget what year it was, but this again was at the Graysonville Colored School, which it sits where the Graysonville Community Center is now.
I love that this was apparently in February too. The board in the back says February on it. How very appropriate.
Cool. So here's a little map to sort of show you where these little neighborhoods was within the Narrows. So we had Sandpile, like I said, it was over where the parking lot of Bridges is. Also, I want to say Harold Thomas and Sons and B&S Fisheries were also located in this little area where Sandpile was. So Sandpile was like the boatyard, Fisherman's Inn, Crab Deck, that area. Bloodfield was sort of over there where the Hilton and Jetty are, in that parking lot as well. Sugar Hill was across the street, sort of next to where the Best Western is. The bottom was where the drawbridge was, and then they called the area where Harris's and United Shellfish were on the west side, back the track or across the track. So that just gives you an idea of, where the community extended. And this was the timeline for the project. We're currently doing the public research, sort of like I said, taking those themes and taking what we've pulled from the oral histories and digging deeper into that to affirm and confirm, what people have shared with us. Soon we will start planning the exhibit. And then in July, we will be opening the exhibit. And then, like I said earlier, future projects include a book and getting a public marker for this community to acknowledge their history. And our funding is provided by Maryland Humanities and Stories of the Chesapeake. All right.
This is so cool. So I think if you guys want, you can either unmute yourself and ask a question, or if you're more comfortable, you can put it in the chat there. I know I've got one. Do you have like a ballpark on approximately how many people lived in the Shantytowns?
I don't, but considering, I guess, that there were 200 shanties, probably
a lot.
Upwards of 500 to 1,000 people, probably, at one time.
We have a question in the chat that says, how were the names names of Shantytown derived? Is it specifically just Bloodfield, I think, Tasha?
I think that from what was shared with me, that was a particularly dangerous neighborhood, very territorial, so it probably could literally lots of blood was shed. And Sugar Hill, someone told me that came from the fact that there was a particular family that had a lot of pretty daughters in their family, so that's where the name Sugar Hill came from. I'm not sure about San Powell, but I'm guessing San Powell is from probably piles of sand, but also like just the piles of oysters that were there.
Frank asks, were the shanties occupied year-round, or was it a seasonal thing?
I believe probably in the beginning, year-round, because some people still, commuted sort of back and forth. But over time, it became a year-round thing as the families decided to stay in the area.
Interesting.
And even after the packing houses closed, people continue to live in the shanties. I believe the last ones were raised in 92.
Wow.
Sunny, I have a couple of questions.
Go ahead,
Doug. Vicki introduced herself earlier, Vicki Surfus, and she had called me 3 weeks ago and said that there was a shanty left at the Dominion Marina. And she asked me if I would come and photograph it because she wanted to do a painting of it. She had mentioned when she spoke earlier that she wanted to paint it. And the gentleman that we spoke to that asked us what were we doing on the property to take a picture, his name is Tom Jones. And he gave us the name of the elderly African-American man who had lived there up until about 5 or 6 years ago. He said that an ambulance came and took him away and he passed away. His name was Russell Coleman, but for some reason he went by the name of Russell Snowden. And I spoke with his son, whose name is Wesley Ford. Mr. Jones gave me his phone number, and Mr. Ford told me that his dad was 86 when he passed away, but he was living in this building, which I have a photograph of it, which I can put it on the screen, but I don't know if everybody can see this or not because it's.
No, that looks good.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's awesome.
One of our guests, Sunny Kelly, says that it was her uncle was the last occupant of that shanty.
Oh,
specifically.
Hi, Miss Sunny.
She also added that Bloodfield was named for that because there were a lot of deaths that occurred either by drowning or physical violence. So,
Yolanda, your presentation is incredibly it's just invaluable. And I'm sorry that our photographs of those of us who are on this Zoom link kind of blocks some of the photographs that you had posted on your PowerPoint. And I'd like to, I don't know if you can email me any of the photographs particularly of the buildings themselves. I could see a couple of them in the background, but they were
Mhm.
very small.
Sure.
Rather than use this photograph of this building, and there was a power line that went into this building, and Wesley Ford said that his grandfather heated the building with a kerosene stove.
Very common.
And
That's correct.
I was assuming that he heated it with an electric heater, but Wesley said that no, it was a kerosene stove. And so there was one question I had from your presentation. You had said that when the new bridge was built, that many of the African-American people there lost their property. And is that the Kent Narrows Bridge that you were
Yes, the
talking
Kent
about?
Narrows Bridge.
Okay.
The old bridge would be the drawbridge, and they refer to the newer bridge, the Kent Narrows Bridge, as.
And when you said they lost their property, was that due to eminent domain that the
Yes.
property? So was any of that property titled to them, or I'm assuming they lost that they had paid for the property? I don't know if it was deeded to them.
Can you clarify that a little bit more?
Do you know if the property was deeded to any of those folks that lost it?
You mean they owned it outright, or?
Yes. Yes.
I don't know that for sure, but that is something that will be investigated as we do more research.
There's been some stories recently in the last week of people across the nation who lost their property. It was deeded to them, and it was taken from them through the power of eminent domain, where the government declares your property is essentially it's not yours anymore because they're getting ready to build a airport or a bridge. And they would just condemn the property. The government would condemn the property and then take it away from the people that it was titled to, and they were not reimbursed. And there's stories in the last week that have come out across the nation of folks who that happened to are getting their property back. And it's a slow and tedious process because of checking land records and so forth. But I know it was on the news here Friday. There was a story about some folks in California, and there was a couple months ago on 60 Minutes, they had one where there was a beach resort that was a Black-owned beach resort, which was taken away by the government through eminent domain. And the family that it was taken from has, in the last year or two, have gotten all of that property back, which had been commercialized. So the government in California apparently had to pay millions of dollars to people to say, hey, this property belongs to these folks. It was stolen from them. And so there's things like that. And I was just curious because you had said these folks lost their property when the new bridge was built. And I was wondering if you had any, what you meant by lost their property.
Yeah, so some property was taken via eminent domain, and some property owners did sell their land as well. But yeah, that's something I'll have to look deeper into regarding whether the property was deeded.
And the phone number on the screen is the one that I can call you if I have some questions.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I'm
Thank
going
you.
to throw a few more questions to Yolanda real quick so we can get into our breakout rooms. But Benta had asked, why did the packing houses close?
I think well, I know that there was a decrease in the harvesting of oysters and clams due to two diseases
Interesting.
that affected the Chesapeake Bay. And that was in the 70s.
Gotcha.
So business decreased, and there was no longer a need for some of the packing houses.
Gotcha. What was the approximate year that some of the shanties were in your pictures? So like what's, I guess, the time frame that these occupations were?
Yes. So the pictures that featured the Sandpile community, they were from the 50s, 1957, I believe is the exact date.
Miss Sunny said that there was a decline in industry if there were a couple of bad storms too. So let me see, do we have any more in here? Frank wanted to know if there's any plumbing inside of the shanties.
No plumbing. They went to a bathroom that was either provided, outside of the dwelling, a communal bathroom, or inside the packing house.
Gotcha. Wow.